Good morning and welcome to New Thought Community. I'm excited to be here with you in this virtual format to share a talk with you today that hopefully will get you thinking and carry you through the week. The title of my talk is The Year of the Hierophant. There is a tarot card for each year, and I'm going to introduce what that means and explain that. And the card for this year is the Hierophant, thus the title. So first, let me talk a little bit about tarot and a little bit about tarot card of the year and what that means. And then we'll move into talking particularly about this year and what I think the spiritual message is behind the Hierophant being the card of the year this year. So the traditional tarot deck, which I'm holding here in my hands, is made up of 78 cards. 22 of those are what are called the major Arcana cards. They're major because they represent archetypes, life themes, life lessons, kind of karmic influences that carry through our lives and kind of our soul journey. Personally, I think of them as kind of embodying the I'm kind of a big deal mentality. That's how they feel to me when I'm reading and I pull those, like, all right, this is a big deal for some reason. And then, your goal is to figure out what that reason is. Every year is associated with a particular major Arcana card. So you can find out which card that is by adding up the numbers in the year and then looking to the corresponding numbered card in the major Arcana. So because it's 2021, we add up the 2, the 0, the 2, and the 1 and get the 5. And the fifth major Arcana card is the Hierophant. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here. And again, this is the traditional look of the Hierophant card. Some of them look really different if you're using a themed deck, but I'm going to talk about this card because it's the traditional look. Personally, it's one of my favorite cards in the deck, in part because it's complicated, and I enjoy kind of complicated cards and things that get us thinking about tensions and contradictions and kind of forcing us to grapple with that. Some general things about the Hierophant. He is considered one of the masculine cards in the deck, so I will refer to him as he, but I mean masculine not in a male-female sex or gender way, but masculine in terms of the characteristics that we tend to associate with masculinity. He's also seen as the teacher of wisdom. Sometimes he's referred to not as the Hierophant, but as the Pope. So that kind of brings along with it some of its own imagery, probably in your mind. The Hierophant is considered the bridge between heaven and earth. He connects God or the divine source, whatever terminology you want to use, to humans, to those of us in the earthly plane. He's, looks pretty fancy in terms of his religious imagery. He's got the crown, he's got the cross. If you can see, the cross has sort of 3 lines moving through it. That stands for Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So kind of a very traditional religious imagery associated with this card. It can be read that way, but it doesn't have to be, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. What else? He's got the 2 pillars next to him, which represent law and liberty. They could also represent obedience and disobedience. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's 2 keys at his feet there. Those are considered either the keys to heaven or the keys to unlock the mysteries of the universe. Either way, he's the one that holds the keys, so he's the one that has to open that for us. There's 2 people in front of him. These 2 kind of balding images look more like male characters. But the 2 people in front of him, he is considered to be passing down spiritual wisdom to them. So he's really seen as a conduit in some ways that the people see the Pope, even today, as the conduit between us and God, or us and heaven. So I know that this card has a lot of traditional Christian connotations to it. That might be a draw for some people and might be a turnoff for other people. With most things in tarot, it is in part what we bring to the card. So if those of you that pull cards, you understand this, I'm sure. And those of you that don't, just at least for the purposes of my talk, cards have some notions of meaning, and then it's also what we ascribe to the card. So as I talk a little bit about the year of the Hierophant, I'm going to talk about some of those kind of traditional themes, words, associations with the card, and I'll also share some of my personal associations with the card. It'll give you hopefully some tangible examples of what those things actually look like in practice. But I also invite you to think about, well, what does that mean for me? And so you might want to take a look at the Hierophant card, either pull it out of your deck if you have one, or Google Hierophant images and you'll get all kinds of images. And think about it and kind of sit with it if you're called to do so, and consider, what does this mean for me? Because the answer to that question is really the most important answer. And what I am going to talk about today is my interpretation and my thoughts, but it's really your interpretation and your thoughts that are the most important for you. So I invite you to do that if that's of interest to you. For me, in general, when I pull the Hierophant, when I see him somewhere, if he's mentioned, I immediately think of my first cat, Handsome. Because for me, he was really a teacher of wisdom and really helped me figure out what it meant to connect to the divine. So sometimes cards represent people or beings, and so that's one of the meanings that I bring to the card. And so for me, that's a very kind of loving, soft image. That might be very counter to how somebody might think of the Pope, right, as this sort of knowing, necessary go-between between us and heaven. That's certainly not a wrong interpretation of the Hierophant, but that's not personally kind of immediately where I go when I see the card. I think of my sweet baby boy and his little pink toes, and I get the warm and fuzzies about that in terms of what it means for me. Tarot cards can be read right side up or upside down. Upside down oftentimes is called a reversed card, and that can change the card meaning. So I'm going to talk about both meanings. First, we'll talk about him right side up and kind of, so what does that symbolize? We'll talk about him in the reverse position, and then we'll talk about, so what does this mean for us spiritually for this year? So right side up, he is associated with the establishment, the status quo. You might think of it as kind of the man, whatever you might associate the man to be, whether that's boss at work or the government, whoever you consider that established entity to be, and certainly that can change in different contexts. He also represents doing this way because it's the way that we have always done it, kind of traditional power structures, social norms, routines, rituals. Therefore, there's also a sense of conformity or conforming to whatever those traditions are. Sometimes it can be thought of in the context of spiritual institutions, churches, organized religions, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Conventionality, this notion of following the rules, respecting tradition, and so other kind of established structures besides churches, governments, schools. Those are some of the ones that initially come to mind for me. There can be some sense of comfort that comes from the Hierophant right side up, because there's a sense of comfort in being with community and connecting with others and engaging in sacred practices or rituals, right? Whether that's something tied to a spiritual experience, right, like attending a church service, or engaging in other kinds of spiritual rituals like a despacho, like a wedding ceremony that might also be grounded in somebody's religious orientation. Can also be things like birthdays, traditional ways that a family or a community might celebrate something, a rite of passage. For me, one of the immediate images that comes to mind is graduation ceremonies. As a faculty member, graduation ceremonies have a kind of an additional layer of pomp and circumstance. If you have been to one, especially one at the collegiate level, you know that we dress in very traditional looking robes, a regalia that somebody would wear at graduation, someone who holds a PhD. So what I would wear when I go to graduation is the traditional black robe. They have stripes on the arms. The stripes are different colors for different people, and those colors symbolize things within the academy. There's also a hood that buttons to the back, and there are different colors to the hood, which represent the areas of your discipline, as well as the place where you graduated with your PhD. And there's the silly little hats with the tassels that come down, and those also look different ways depending on the degree that you hold, and the color of the tassel can also be different depending on the degree that you hold. So for me, putting that on, being in a room where my graduating students and my colleagues, my administration, were all wearing that. For me, it is just very old school, traditional notions of the academy and who we are and how we dress and what we celebrate. So to me, very much about kind of the establishment in terms of my my career and my practice as a professional. I also think about the feeling that I get when I'm in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of celebration of America and who we are, right? If you go to the National Archive, you can see the Declaration of Independence, you can see the Constitution. There's a lot of celebration of kind of the ideals of America. And for us now, hundreds of years later, those ideals are part of the establishment. The Declaration of Independence in the beginning was kind of a pushback against the establishment, right? We are no longer going to be a part of you. We are going to be our own entity. Now, for me, when I look at it, it represents who we are as an entity. Some of the more negative connotations, corrupt systems of power. One of those being patriarchy. We've been talking about that more and more as a society. That is also another one of the more negative connotations that the Hierophant carries for me. Let's talk about the Hierophant in the reversed position. Here's where I think things get a little interesting, if you ask me. So in the reversed position, we think about kind of blocking the upright energy, or kind of a shift or turning upside down, literally and figuratively, of that energy. So the Hierophant upside down symbolizes nonconformity, rebellion, pushing against the establishment, developing new methods and ways of doing things, turning the tradition on its head, refusing to go along with the status quo. Trying or initiating unorthodox approaches that defy social norms, right? Going against the grain, breaking free from shackles of convention. Right? Just because that's how we've always been doing it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how I want to do it, or that's how we should do it in this case. So really pushing back against that, rule breaking, if you will. Reminds me a little bit of Science of Mind classes, because one of the things that we focus on in Science of Mind is that you are your own teacher, that we don't look to a pope or a saint or a pastor, anyone outside of us to teach us, right? To teach us about the divine, to teach us how to be in the world. You are your own teacher, and your wisdom comes from within you, not from an outside power. That takes a lot of self-trust to be able to do that. And so for me, that's what the first year of Science of Mind is about, in part, is kind of figuring out that self-trust and recognizing it and kind of experimenting with listening to ourselves and, all right, so what is my wisdom? How do I communicate that wisdom to myself? How do I ask myself for that? How do I figure out what that means for me? Other kind of personal meanings that I have around the Hierophant are really anything that has to do with challenging the status quo, pushing back against this idea of this is how we do things because this is how we've always done them, right? And taking a closer look at, well, how do we want to continue to do things with the old way or with a new way? And so for me, that's people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, women's suffragists like Alice Paul, who really bucked the system and said, yeah, that's how we've always done it, but there's facets of the system that are broken, and I am not going to participate in those broken pieces of the system. I'm going to figure out how to build new structures into the system that are, more equal, more respectful, that create opportunities for dignity across the board. So what does it mean for us now in the middle of April in 2021, the year of the Hierophant? So to me, the fact that we're in April still means that there's a lot of opportunity in 2021 for us to embrace this energy and learn from it and think about how we want to use it. I think we're being called to interrogate old systems and determine whether they're working or not. And if they're not, then we have an opportunity to build something better together, figure out, so what does better mean? What does that look like? What do we want to try to do to create that for us? And to create that for us at every level, right? Intrapersonally, interpersonally, in our relationships, in our spiritual community, in our workplaces, in our larger community, in our state. We can keep moving up and up and up in terms of the level. But I think the opportunity exists at all the levels. It just depends where we want to put our focus. I would also add, and kind of wanting to branch and bring in some of Reverend Lucy's reading for today about our neighbor, because we are not separate from each other, because what impacts me impacts you and vice versa. It's not just about whether it's working for me, it's also about, well, how is this working or not working for my neighbor, for my family, for my coworkers, for other people in my spiritual community. Because if it's not working for them, it's also not working for me. And so there's opportunities for change in that as well. Spiritually, I think there's some other opportunities for us to remember. One of our fundamental principles, and probably for me the most fundamental spiritual principle, which is that you are God, Spirit, Source, Goddess, whatever term resonates with you, just fill it in the blank there. That you are the divine. You do not need a go-between to connect to the divine. If you want to connect to that, we just move within, and we have the ability to connect with it right there inside of us. I'd like to share with you a short quote from the movie Dogma. Quote, "Organized religion destroys who we are by inhibiting our action, by inhibiting our decisions out of fear of some intangible parent figure who shakes a finger at us from thousands of years ago and says, do it." Kind of that image with that. I bring that quote in not to problematize organized religions by any means, but rather to highlight this idea of an intangible figure outside of us shaking their finger at us. I think if I was giving this talk in person in the sanctuary, I would hear some laughter probably at this point of this notion of an intangible divine figure waving its finger at us. Because it's an illusion, right? That God is not outside of you. God is inside of you. You are that God spark. It's really an opportunity to remind ourselves and reground ourselves in the first and second steps of spiritual mind treatment, because they specifically, without a doubt, lay this out, right? The first one is the recognition, right? Recognizing God, spirit, the divine is all that there is. Step 2, unification, right? Unifying our consciousness with the divine. And we speak that into being by saying things like, because God is all there is, God is in me, with me, around me, working through me right now. I don't have to look outside for it. When I want it, I look within it. To me, this is what the year of the Hierophant is here to remind us, that we are all made of that star stuff, that divine spark, and we are all consciously creating. So what do we want to create? My invitation to you, if you so choose, is to go within and think about that and get in alignment. Take a look at your values. What do my values say? And then act in accordance with those values. Might be to reaffirm some of those traditions and rituals, that the way that we have been doing this is in alignment and feels really good to me. And so I want to continue with that practice, because that's what is recognizing and embodying and manifesting my values. Sometimes we might look at something and say, the old way, not really working for me so much. I was doing it because I was sort of on autopilot. We do it because we're routine animals. And so I'm just going to keep doing that routine. But now that I'm looking at it, this needs to change, this needs to go, this needs to be refashioned in order to be in alignment. And then it's an opportunity to try some things out and refashion that in a way that feels more in alignment with who you are and in alignment with what you see as what's best for your neighbor, for your community, for your relationship, for your workplace. So given that, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Right? You can live according to rules and within boundaries set by society, but ensure that this is in accordance with your individuality and your integrity. And if it's not, it's time to change society. Ensure that it treats all living beings with respect and dignity. And if it does not, it's time to change society. Thank you.